We noticed this morning a few of the reasons, at least that we could tell, for why Paul returned as often as he did to Antioch. I hadn't really thought about that until some other study that I've been doing and then in preparing this lesson. And of course, we don't know the full picture. We don't know the names of too many people there. But we get a general idea of the work, and knowing what we do about Antioch and knowing what we do about Paul, I don't think it's hard to see why they were able to work together as often as they did. As I mentioned this morning, though, tonight, I want to think about where else would Paul go if Paul were here in the year 2023. Where would he go, and where would he go back to, and where would he continue to go back to? And I want to think about and in some ways give a little bit of information about the Philippines. Some of you have heard some reports that Dad has given from time to time about that, but because of the level of involvement in Joel and I going and in your part in sending us, I want to talk a little bit about that tonight, and then also take some of the things we looked at this morning and use that as an opportunity to think about us. Would we be a place that Paul would come again and again? Let me just tell you a few things about the Philippines. They composed of over 7,000 islands. Of course, most of those would not be inhabited. There are just several main islands where the majority of people live. There's about 80 million people there, and because of their history with Spain, the traveler Magellan, I believe, was the one who went from Spain to the Philippines. So because of that part of their history, whereas we usually think about that part of the world and the different Eastern or Oriental religions that are more common in that part of the world, the Philippines are an exception to that, and they are really culturally Catholic. That presents its own challenges in some ways, but again, as opposed to going to most places in that part of the world where the Bible would not really be ingrained in the culture, in the Philippines it is. And so that provides a starting place in many ways, that people are already, at least to some degree, familiar with the Bible and open to reading and teaching from it. Often the question is asked, well, do you have to have an interpreter since you're going to a foreign country? And in the public education system, English is taught in their schools. And so they do have their own language, and they actually have a number of different dialects. And it's interesting that sometimes Filipinos from different parts of the country, they meet each other, and their dialect is so different they can't understand each other, and so they talk in English. And so depending on where you are, if you're in an area that is relatively well educated, then there's typically not a need for translators. It's a convenient season to go to the Philippines, in part because of the wealth of our nation. You know, sometimes when we invite a guest speaker up, we'll say, come and come work, and we'll be glad to cover your expenses. Well, of course, brethren there could not make an offer like that. And how long our nation will have the prosperity, conveniences, and comforts that we do, we don't know. But because of what we have, then this is a time to go to places where there is a reception for the work. And so this makes it much easier for us to go to see them. Another factor related to what we studied this morning is the educational opportunities in our land and in our nation. They do have public education in the Philippines, but it's not free. And so you have to pay for materials, and you have to pay to go. So that's going to obviously limit, especially in a third world country, access to that. But think about it in our nation, where the ability to read and to read deeply is pretty much assumed in our nation. And so think for a moment about the effect of that upon the Lord's people, that in light of the teachers that we noticed this morning in Antioch and in different places in our nation, well, if you have more of God's people who can read and who can study and have access to different tools, then it ought to be that then you have more teachers. And so our nation really does have a wealth of teachers. And so that having more than enough, then it's a time where we can go to places, not that they don't have teachers there, for certain they do, but to go and offer whatever help we have that we could provide. My dad has my dad has visited the Philippines since the year 1995. I was a senior in high school, so I remember well the first time that he went. And I think he would say, like Paul, that there have been many reasons that he has observed that have urged him to go back and to continue to go back. And so I want to use just as an outline for that, why go to the Philippines? There are already Christians there. There are already preachers there. What are some reasons for teachers to continue to go back, just as Paul did to Antioch? And you'll recognize these points. We're just going to review what we did this morning. In the Philippines, it's seen, just like in Antioch, that they are willing to teach the lost without prejudice. In James chapter 2 and verse 1, James urged the brethren there, "Do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality." And so that could happen, that could be in a racial context, it could be from an economic context. Well, somebody's too rich, I couldn't try to teach them. Somebody's too poor, I wouldn't want to try to teach them. That's not their approach in the Philippines. The Philippine society is different in ours in the sense that they have very little middle class. America, in contrast to that, we have a large percentage of a middle class. In the Philippines, it's more the haves and the have-nots. And so different in that way. But in the Philippines, at least among the brethren, the majority of brethren there are poor. There are some who have more, some who would be rich. But whether rich or poor, they're willing to go out and to teach those who have more and to teach those who have less, regardless of that. And so that provides the kind of mindset of people with whom we can work. Let me give this example. There's a brother. His name is Julie Notarte, and for decades he has gone, and I've read for a few years his reports. He lives in the southernmost island of Mindanao, and if you ever hear about Muslim insurgencies and such, it's almost always from that island. There's a heavier concentration of Muslims in that country, and they're often causing problems and rebelling against the government. So he lives on that island, and for decades he drives into the mountains, into these little villages and areas where there are people who they don't come out of the mountains, or they rarely do, but he goes to them. He goes to and even through places that are dangerous because of these militant Muslims and government rebels. He goes frequently to teach the lost, and then when there are brethren in these places, he goes to visit them and to teach them and encourage them in extremely isolated places. I've even read his reports long enough to notice he often goes into debt, sometimes just in order to deliver food or medicine, or someone dies and they don't have the family doesn't have enough money to cover the funeral expenses, and so he'll just pay for it or take out a loan in order to help them. The point is he just goes, regardless of whether these people live within a comfortable distance of his home. If he knows how to get there, then to the best of his ability, he will get there. One other example, there are brethren, and there are some in America as well, who teach in jails and in prisons. There's one brother who was wrongfully incarcerated, and his name is Willie Pastor. He was put into prison because of problems in the judicial system, but while he was there, he was a Joseph of sorts. He taught literally hundreds of people the gospel while he was there. And then after his time was served, and I believe his sentence was reduced for good behavior, the authorities there requested that he would continue to come back and work with inmates. And so my dad has gone there. I've gone with him into the prison there to teach. And so those are not people below him. He didn't belong there by fairness, but he was there. And so while he was there, he worked. And this is just typical of the mindset of many brethren there. And if the gospel is truly in our hearts, it will be typical of us as well. And so you want to be around people who want to teach the lost just as much as you. And so in the Philippines, there are brethren like that. In 3 John, verse 8, a few brethren who had traveled and teaching had come back to John and had given a report about the time that they had spent in this place to whom he writes. We don't know where it was or who they were, but he commends them for receiving these brethren and then sending them on their way. And in verse 8, John says, "We therefore ought to receive such, that we may become fellow workers for the truth." That describes, though we didn't read this verse, that described the people in Antioch. They were fellow workers for the truth with Paul. Not all of those from Antioch could go where Paul did, but they helped him and encouraged him and sent him out. And God considers such people fellow workers for the truth. In the Philippines, they invite teachers to come and to work along beside them. They're not inviting us to come and host medical missions and clothing giveaways and food distribution and school supply distribution to the community so that they can be known in the community. That's not what they're inviting us to come and do. They invite us to come and to teach the Word of God day or night and for as long as circumstances reasonably allow. What do they have medical needs? Christians there have medical needs, and there are places where food is more difficult than in other places. There are some who lack clothing at times or school supplies. And when there are natural disasters, and the Philippine Islands are just in a part of the world that invites natural disasters. And so they often have tsunamis and other storms and volcanoes and problems. So they have all the same problems, and they don't have all the solutions that we do. Your average Filipino wouldn't have an emergency fund set aside of 3 to 6 months worth of expenses in case there's a rainy day. The average Filipino would not have an insurance policy on his house or his vehicle if he has a vehicle. They might have that, but just not all the layers that we do. They would not have reliable government programs during the pandemic. That helped, whether long-term it helped or not. That was a part in our country of what kept some continuity economically in our society. They just don't have those same layers of undergirding the society economically. And yet the brethren there don't invite us to come with money bags. There are problems, and they'll share their problems. But the reason that they invite us is to come and to teach. They encourage teachers to come. Might be even good for you to know they don't require that you be a full-time preacher. The first time that I went to the Philippines was immediately after I graduated from college studying speech pathology. And since my dad was already going, I thought, well, before I have a regular job and time off is a little more difficult just in between that break, I went with him, and that was about 2 years before I began preaching. Not long ago, a young couple from the church where Dad is went, a young man who was studying to be a doctor, and he and his wife went. That young man had only been a Christian, I think, about 5 years, but he was a good student, and so he was willing to go and encourage them and teach. And so, as mentioned a moment ago, the typical American standard of wealth and of education makes many Americans qualified to go over and not just encourage them by their presence. That certainly in and of itself is something to them. But many American Christians would be qualified to go and to teach and encourage them because of the many opportunities that we have because of the wealth of our nation. And so when there are people who are willing to go in the Philippines, there are people who are willing to have you come. They encourage teachers to come they also encourage teachers to go. We saw Antioch did that with Paul. They continued sending him away, and he continued to come back. In the Philippines, while it's not as common for them to have someone who's able to do the work of an evangelist on an ongoing basis without having to supplement their income in some other way to provide for their family, that's not as common. But when there are men who are devoted to do the work of an evangelist, the attitude of the church is there is the same as ours here. When there's an opportunity to go, they send them out to go. From reports and others that I read, I just see clues like this. They'll send a preacher out to go visit another church, maybe nearby or maybe farther away. Sometimes preachers will even kind of team up from an area and go to a place where there is no church, and maybe they know a family there, so they'll go have a Bible study there and try to teach that family. So there could be a new church there, or they may even go to a new community and just pass out teaching literature in the community in the hopes of finding interest in the gospel. Preachers will work together, sometimes having Bible studies in one community or another, just them together. And then sometimes when my father or others can go, there will be opportunities for training and teaching and deepening the knowledge of these brethren. And my point is that the churches have the outlook to send these evangelists out to do that work. And so we're another way where it's obvious of the wealth of our nation is the opportunity I have from your help and that of others in our nation, where it's far more common, though certainly not the rule, but where it's more common, where preachers can be fully financially supported to do that work. That while that's less common in the Philippines, the mindset is still the same. That when there's an opportunity to go, they send them out to go. We can share that mindset with those in Antioch, because the gospel is what feeds that kind of teaching or that kind of thinking. Next, in Ephesians chapter 4, in verse 11, Paul describes that after Jesus was raised from the dead, when he ascended, in verses 7 through 9, then in verse 11 he says that he himself gave gifts. And the gifts that he describes are these specific workers and the specific responsibilities that they were given. And so you have apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And so how is it, as we talked about this morning, how is it that there comes to be evangelists? How is it that there come to be pastors? How is it that there come to be teachers? Well, it's not some supernatural, miraculous event. It's not as though someone just lays hands on someone else and then you immediately have a teacher. But it comes from the heart of someone who is interested in learning and then who is interested in sharing what they've learned with others. And so that requires a process of developing teachers. And in the Philippines, they make those same kinds of efforts. Sometimes when my father goes, a church will host a preacher training so that any among the church there or brethren from other nearby places will come. Sometimes it's teenagers. Even on a few occasions, there are young men even before their teenage years. And they're already interested in studying the Bible, studying it deeply, learning how to teach. There are people that young people in the Philippines, some of them they're already thinking about, well, maybe I could do the work of an evangelist someday. And even if not, their skills and their abilities to teach are already being primed and being developed. In the Philippines, again, they welcome others who can come help them in that, but they're using the opportunities that they have to develop teachers among themselves, as opposed to saying, well, when Americans come over to teach us, then we'll be ready to listen. Well, they are, but just not that alone. They're developing teachers among themselves, just as I suppose that Antioch was doing. Read this morning from Romans chapter 12, verses 6 verses 6 through 13, which is just a series of admonitions and reminders that Paul was giving to the saints there. And among them, in verse 13, is distributing to the needs of the saints. Christians in the Philippines practice that as well. We typically think that they are the ones on the receiving end of that. They're the ones who are typically in need, and that's certainly true. But let me just remind you and encourage you maybe that they also take the responsibility of providing for one another within the Philippine Islands. I asked my dad for some help of some examples of this. He gave me these two examples. Around 6 years ago, a tsunami hit a section of the Philippines called the Visayas, and he said that tsunami was so big that it lifted up ships, and the wave would carry huge ships to another place. And so, of course, when a wave like that hit the land, then it would have devastated homes and public buildings and brethren, their buildings as well. And so Dad is always in communication with brethren on those occasions, and he noticed that many churches within the Philippines were sending help to the brethren in that region to provide for them to the best of their ability. So they didn't hit the panic button and, okay, Americans, come over and send money to us. I'm sure help was sent on that occasion, but brethren in the Philippines say, let's provide for our brethren even if they're not in the same community that we're in. Also, he mentioned that from October of 2019 into May of 2020, and of course that would have then overlapped some with the COVID pandemic and all of the complications from that. But over that about a year and a half, or excuse me, about half a year, there were 16 earthquakes in the southern, especially hit the southern island of Mindanao. And again, without going into all the details, Dad just mentioned that he knew of brethren throughout the Philippines who were sending aid down to brethren in those islands. So does that relieve us that, well, we don't need to help them because they're taking care of it? Of course, that's not the point, but isn't it encouraging to know that brethren, even living in poverty, that they have a kind of heart and the kind of love for brethren near to them, or even not so near to them, that when they need help, they're willing to provide that. And by such things, the grace of God was seen in the church at Antioch and can be seen among brethren there as well. One other thing that we noted that we can still see about the church at Antioch, that Paul would have as well, was that they were willing to defend the gospel. And so we see that most clearly in Antioch in Acts chapter 15 regarding the controversy over circumcision. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, Paul wrote to the Romans there and said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And the Romans obviously shared that. Paul was writing to them. He believed they were of that mindset. And he said, I hope to come to you. And so Paul shared this focus of confidence in the gospel of Jesus Christ and a willingness to defend that. In the Philippines, they face many of the same challenges that we do in the work of trying to spread the gospel. There are most, if not all, of the world religions present in the Philippines. And so Islam, Buddhism, and then they even have some native pagan religions, kind of like some native Alaskans have here. The Catholic religion, of course, is very influential there, as well as various Protestant groups. And then there's also a native church, so to speak, in the Philippines, and they call themselves Iglesia Ni Cristo. And if you had a 6-month course in 7th grade in Spanish, you might even be able to translate that. That would be Church of Christ. And it started, I think, in the early 1900s. There was a Filipino who claimed to be a prophet. And so this is kind of a homegrown religious group. And there's even a group here in Fairbanks. Brandon, if you remember, we went and tried to study with some of them a year or two ago, but they're very influential in the Philippine Islands. So they face that, and then especially Western influence and the materialism from the West is having influence there. And so with that comes all of the skepticism and the unbelief about the very fundamentals of God and the Bible and our confidence in those things. So, brethren over there face the same kind of battles and struggles that we do in trying to spread the gospel and in trying to defend the gospel. And the brethren there are not any more ashamed of that than you and I. And they also face the same kind of challenges from brethren that we do. They're just as there are brethren here in Fairbanks, there are also in the Philippines who use the local church to host games and camps and medical services for the community and such. And so that's present there just as it is here. And so they try to teach, but also recognize those differences among brethren there. And so they're willing to defend not just the first principles, but also the second principles of the gospel in the places that they are. So there's certainly other details and others who would know more details than I do, but here are the kind of reasons that my dad has decided to continue going back. This trip, Lord willing for me, would just be my 9th time there, and of course Joel his first trip. But these are the kinds of things that are present there that are a reason to go and to continue to go. And so one more time, read with me Romans chapter 12, verses 6 through 13. Just these short series of statements. And as I read, think about the fact there are brethren in these places who are practicing these same things just as we read about in Antioch. Romans chapter 12 and verse 6. Their brethren today having then gifts, differing according to the grace that is given to them. And so they can today, just as brethren then would use their gifts. When there is prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith, or ministry. Let us use it in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching, he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love. In honor, giving preference to one another. Not lagging in diligence. Fervent in spirit. Serving the Lord. Rejoicing in hope. Patient in tribulation. Continuing steadfastly in prayer. Distributing to the needs of the saints. And given to hospitality. And so this is what causes the gospel to grow wherever God's people are, and that continues to happen in the Philippine Islands. So then let's think about us. Are these same traits present here? As James chapter 1 says, let's let the perfect law of liberty be like a mirror for us so that we look at it and then not go away forgetting what we saw or what we learned. But let's look at this and see, are we the kind of place that Paul would have come to and then Paul would have continued to come to? If he would have, what would he see? Oh, it would mean coming here and seeing that here are people who teach the lost without prejudice. I won't go back and read again these verses that we already have. This is just an opportunity to ask ourselves, is there anyone that I would not tell the gospel to if I had the opportunity? Would it be too risky? Have I ever avoided the subject when a door was open? What is our reputation and what is our mindset? How far outside of Fairbanks would we be willing to go to try to take the gospel? We live here, so this is where our primary influence is, but what else would we at least be willing to do? And I've wondered maybe the radio program, though we primarily hope that can teach people here that we could reach. I've learned that it's transmitted to several places throughout the state, down to the Houston, Alaska area, and even out into some villages. If someone heard and was willing to be receptive, what would we be willing to do? At the booths that we set up in the community, of course, those sometimes are events that draws people from outlying areas. What would we be willing to do given the opportunity? Would we willing to teach? Are we willing to teach the lost without prejudice? Would Paul see in us that we encourage teachers to come? As John wrote, that we might be fellow workers for the truth. And this is a good opportunity for me to thank you again for inviting me to come work with you almost or over 4 years ago. That's been an encouragement to me, but this lesson is not focused on me. But despite our remote location, haven't we been blessed by people who are willing to come? We want to have the mindset to encourage teachers to come. Does God see in us the mindset that we'll continue to have to encourage teachers to go? I hope this trip to the Philippines and maybe a few of the things that I say tonight will encourage you in some way. But even though Joel and I would have the most benefit from being able to go, I hope I hope that something in your part of this will make this trip also beneficial for this church in some way. I hope that as we go, you'll think about it much differently than when we go down to visit our family. But think about it just like when Antioch sent Paul away to Jerusalem or out into other regions to teach. I hope you'll think about this in that way and think about the ways that it's true that you are sending me. Much of the teaching that I'll be doing there, it's lessons that I've either developed during the time that you give me on a weekly basis, or some that I've continued to revise and to use. One part of this trip that my dad suggested, because he was bringing along such a younger man with him, is that we do some lessons, and also because of having Joel with us, that we do some lessons especially for younger people. And so in the course of planning and talking to my dad about that, I mentioned to him this monthly class that I do called Remember Your Creator. And so I'm going to take some of what I've developed there and use that on a few occasions. It won't be the majority of the time, but a few occasions I'll be able to teach some of the younger ones. And so using the material that I have developed here, using that over there. Again, that comes from the time that you've entrusted me with. Of course, the financial help that you provide to me while I'm gone continues to sustain and provide for my family. And so I hope in these ways, and maybe in other ways I didn't consider, you'll view yourself as you are involved in this trip and the work that we do there. Our expenses for the trip are provided for, but I did want to mention, you've seen in my father's reports from time to time when he goes, he purchases Bibles. And so if anyone wants to send some money to purchase Bibles that primarily go to Christians who do not have their own personal copy of the Bible, that's assumed in our society. And we all have more than one copy, more than one version, maybe even more than one copy of the same version, maybe even more than we can count. That's typical of American luxury, isn't it? But that's not the case there. And so if anyone would like to provide for that, I can carry those funds and help to deliver that. But the point is, let's continue to go when we have opportunities to go. That's the mindset of God's people from the beginning. What does God see here in regards to developing teachers? We're blessed here to have a wide range of ages. I think sometimes people are maybe surprised when they hear about the church here because we're small. Because in many places, churches of this size would be 80% people who are 70 years and older. And nothing wrong with that. God's people are going to be 70 years or older at some point. But many times the long-term outlook for that congregation is just not very good. And so we're blessed with that here. That means we need to constantly be looking to our future. And the future is unknown in many ways, of course, and yet what we do need to do is, based on what we can perceive, look to the future and what are the things that we know with relative confidence we're going to need in the future. Well, we're going to need teachers in the future, not just standing here such as I am in the assembly, but Bible classes in the future, Bible studies in our homes in the future. So there will always be a need for teachers here, won't there? So then the question is, where will they come from? There won't always be a Bill Biscay here to preach, will there? There won't always be a Bob Bursell here to preach, will there? I'm not making any plans to go anywhere. There not always be a David Halbrook to preach here. But not just, again, I don't just mean the preaching in this context, but we have to constantly be looking to the future. Where will teachers come from? Will we just say, well, we'll just hope somebody comes from somewhere? Well, that's not a bad partial plan, because again, in Antioch, they were very blessed by teachers who came from other places. So that's not a criticism, that's not a problem. God provides in that way. But will that be our total plan? Or will we supplement that plan by developing teachers from among us? Some brethren in churches have depended on colleges. The approach, well, let's let the colleges train preachers, and then the colleges should send them out. Well, that's the wrong approach. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, that the things that you've learned, you teach them to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Those who teach need to teach, and then need to use opportunities to teach others to teach. And that's what the church ought to be. The church is the pillar and ground of the truth. We don't have to hand out a certificate or a degree that some state recognizes. God provides, even in small congregations like us, the tools that we need to continue to develop teachers. Doesn't mean we're all teachers of the same maturity or ability or comfort. It doesn't mean we'll all teach on the same occasions. Paul described his work in Acts 20, verse 20. He was teaching publicly and from house to house. Well, good. It was good that Paul could teach publicly and from house to house. But maybe there's some teachers who are just comfortable teaching publicly, or others who are just comfortable teaching in a more private setting, a smaller setting. So none of that is defined or determined. We need teachers in all of the above. And of course, it doesn't mean that we're all teachers. But even those of us who do not teach can aid us in the process of all of the work that goes into ensuring that we are developing teachers. That needs to be seen in us. What do you see? And what does God see in us in that area? What does God see in us? What would Paul have seen in us if he visited and stayed here and assembled with the church here for a year, as he did in Antioch in Acts 11 and verse 26? What would he have seen in the area of assisting brethren in faraway places? I couldn't have come here or stayed here for the past 4 years without the help not only that you provide on a regular basis, but there are also 14 other churches of Christ and also individuals and families who are helping me. And I recognize I mostly benefit by that. And again, I'm not here to talk about myself tonight, but just the nature of the work. I hope that just as Antioch was benefited and blessed by churches and Christians in other places, and then a part of their response to that in Acts chapter 11 was when there was a need in other places, they were happy to have the opportunity to return the favor, so to speak. Maybe there's a better way to say that. But my point is, regarding the many who are helping me, I hope the interest of others is an encouragement to you. And so how should we respond? When others encourage us, well, The response of the gospel is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's what the church in Antioch did in Acts chapter 11 and verse 29. When the disciples heard about the needs of brethren in other places, they were ready and they were willing to do what they could. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, the example of the Christians in the region of Macedonia, which would be Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, that area. That's who he's talking about in 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 2. And he says that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality. And if you remember in chapter 9 and verse 1, he's talking about the funds that were being sent to help the saints over in Judea. So even these in primarily Gentile areas were willing to share with and to help brethren far from them. And that's the kind of heart that we ought to have as well. That's what kept Paul, one possible reason that kept Paul coming back to Antioch. And that's the kind of heart that God is looking for in us. And then last, would Paul continue to come back here seeing Christians who are ready and willing to defend the gospel of Jesus Christ? The fact that Satan is an enemy and the fact that God has given the whole armor to us makes it clear that there is going to be a struggle, that we won't just get to read the Bible and believe in the gospel and then just live happily ever after. Well, there is a happily ever after, but in the meantime, there is a struggle over the gospel. You can't read any New Testament book without finding some struggle, and then without realizing we're going to have the same struggle if we're willing to do the same kind of work. And so let's train ourselves and train each other to fight by learning from the Lord's people in Antioch or Jerusalem or others. Paul must have seen that willingness not to fight for the sake of fighting, but to fight the good fight of faith, as he urged Timothy to do. Paul saw that there, and so he came back, and he came back, and he came back again. And that needs to be the spirit that we have because of our love for God and the gospel that he has shared with us today. What would Paul see if he came to Fairbanks? But of course, Paul is not our judge. Ultimately, that just gives us some insight and some means of reflecting on what does God see among the work that we are each trying to do, both together and then individually in our lives from day to day. Thank you for your encouragement and for your prayers and the plans that Joel and I and my father are making. But turn in your psalm books to number 263. As we do each time, we open God's Word, as we learn to think about things from God's perspective and God's view, then that's an opportunity for us to think about our own souls. And what is God's view of my heart and my soul and my mind and my priorities at this moment, right now? Because there is a heaven and there is a hell. And I'm going to answer this God who is just as much a God of goodness as he is also the God of severity, Romans chapter 11 and verse 22. So we sing this song to urge you, if you are not a Christian tonight, if you need to confess your faith, that Jesus is the Son of God, and to appeal to his death to wash you from your sins and be baptized into Christ. If as a Christian you need our encouragement, our help, or most importantly, if you need to return to your Savior, and we can pray and encourage you and stir you up again. Come forward, tell us how we could help you as we stand and sing.